All right, let's get it started. Let's get the party started. It's a party? It's a party, right? Because it's Black History Month and we have to celebrate. We have to ground ourselves in joy. So welcome everyone. Happy Tuesday. Welcome to Black Writers on Race and the Rise of White Christian Nationalism, which is being sponsored by the Columbia Law School's Law, Rights, and Religion Project, as well as being sponsored by the Secularism Society at Columbia Law School and the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life. So from all of our sponsors and co-sponsors, we want to welcome you to this amazing event. Well, we're going to talk about race, white Christian nationalism, writing, and really how to navigate this new question, is it new, field in the rise of white Christian nationalism. So I want to introduce our speakers today. So first we have Dr. Sabrina Dent, who is a lifelong advocate for human rights and social justice. Prior to assuming the presidency of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, Dr. Dent served as Director of Programs and Partnerships for the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute, and most recently, a Senior Faith Advisor for the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. At Americans United, Dr. Dent served as a member of the Faith for Equality Working Group, where she mobilized religious leaders to amplify faith voices on legislative issues such as the Equality Act to ensure and expand federal legal protections for LGBTQ individuals, people of color, women, and religious minority groups. Dr. Dent co-hosts the Sister Act podcast, and the podcast is dedicated to women of faith from different religious traditions and engages various topics around life, faith, and resilience. Dr. Dent is also the editor and contributing author of the book, African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspective for Congregations and Communities. Here you go, shout out right here. Dr. Dent received her bachelor's degree from Virginia Tech, Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry degrees from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University. So welcome, Dr. Dent.
Thank you so much for having me, Candace. It's
Thank
good
you.
to be with all of you.
And now I have the honor of introducing a lifelong social activist, Dr. Obery Hendricks, who is one of the foremost commentators on the intersections of religion and political economy in America. He is the most widely read and perhaps the most influential African-American biblical scholar writing today. His recent book, Christians Against Christianity, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith, has gathered wide acclaim. Dr. Hendricks has served in the Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group at the United States Department of State under Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. Dr. Hendricks was a member of the Faith Advisory Council of the Democratic National Committee and served on the National Religious Leader Advisory Committee of the 2008 Democratic Presidential Campaign. He is a distinguished senior fellow at the Democracy Collaborative in Washington, D.C., has been an affiliated scholar at the Center for American Progress, was a senior fellow at the Opportunity Agenda Social Justice Communications think tank, is on the advisory board of the Institute of Christian Socialism, and is a member of the board of directors of the Public Religion Research Institute. You are an accomplished scholar. Dr. Hendricks' award-winning book, The Politics of Jesus, Rediscovering the True Revolutionary Nature of Jesus's Teaching and How They Have Been Corrupted, was declared essential reading for Americans by the Washington Post. And with that, I want to thank you, Dr. Hendricks, for being with us in this conversation.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Looking forward to it.
So before we dig just even deeper into the topics of race and white Christian nationalism, I want to recognize the moment that we're in. We are celebrating the beginning of Black History Month. And a lot of times Black History Month, we talk about all the struggles that we've been through as Black folks for the last 400 plus years in this country, but I want to start by centering us in joy. And so for me, when I think of Black History and Futures Month, I'm just thinking of how far we have really come and how far we have to go, which is both a struggle, but also a time for celebration. So I really just want to ask you, what is bringing you joy during this Black History Month before we get into this conversation about race?
Sabrina?
Dr. Hendricks, you know what? Thank you so much. I want to say, first of all, Candace, what is bringing me joy is hearing you say Black History and Futures Month. Like that futures piece, I think is so important in thinking about the younger generations that are coming up, and then what they and we can continue to learn about our history. So that brings me joy in this moment. But I think also seeing the commitment for some communities to be more engaged in learning the truths about our history. And that hasn't always been the case here in America. So I think that is something that is bringing me lots of joy in this moment right now.
Yeah, I second that, Dr. Dent. You know, I can't say I'm feeling a lot of joy, but I'm feeling some hopefulness because I'm seeing a consciousness, political consciousness being raised. And I think that's so important. I'm seeing that some folk are starting to realize how dangerous a moment we're in. So that gives me some hope. And I guess the joy comes from my family's healthy, and we haven't run into any rogue terrorist police yet.
Oof, oof, that is a word.
That is so real.
that is a word. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Dent. Can you just highlight some of your writing on the intersections of race and religion, and then we'll pass it to Dr. Hendricks, and we'll just have a discussion amongst us, and then we'll open it for questions from the audience. So I will hand it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Candace. One of the ways that I felt it would be appropriate to center myself and center this conversation for me would be to read some excerpts from the book, African Americans and Religious Freedom. And so I'll share with you this reading. It was co-authored by my friend and colleague with me, Dr. Corey D.B. Walker. And it's our introduction to the book, African Americans and Religious Freedom. And the title of the introduction is Disrupting the Narrative, African Americans and Religious Freedom. The traditional narrative of religious freedom in America is one of ascension. Despite the intense contestation around the concept from the nation's founding to the present, it is generally understood that religious freedom is a truly unique American development that has consistently expanded across the centuries. Yet, if we begin to interrogate this narrative and begin to examine religious freedom from the perspectives of racial and religious minorities in the United States, we find the narrative insufficient and inadequate in representing the protean nature of this discourse. Indeed, religious freedom has always been more and less than this narrative suggests. As religious studies scholar Finbar Curtis writes, religious freedom is a malleable rhetoric employed for a variety of purposes. Part of the reason for this malleability is that religious identities are themselves produced in response to social and political contests. The inadequacy of this traditional narrative becomes readily apparent when we begin to engage religious freedom from the perspective of African Americans. African American perspectives on religious freedom bring into conversation two fraught discourses animating the contested terrain of American democracy: race and religion. Religious freedom in America is more than a series of simple binaries: Christianity and culture, religious and secular, theism and atheism, tradition and innovation. In America, religious freedom is inextricably bound with ideas and practices of race in the United States. To state this is not simply white over Black, but rather how race constitutes and conditions our cultures, ideas, and institutions. In other words, race is constitutive of religious freedom, just as religious freedom is constitutive of race. We cannot understand one without the other. In this manner, we must move beyond a traditional narrative of religious freedom that can be captured in a hashtag religious freedom so white. African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspectives for Congregations and Communities is a collection of essays examining how and in which ways African Americans have navigated the contested terrain of religious freedom in America. These essays present novel interpretations of religious freedom, critically informed by African American culture, history, ideas, and religious experiences. Just as the traditional narrative of religious freedom is inadequate to represent the history and experience of this ideal in America, there is no singular African American perspective that fully expresses the multiple and varied expressions of this variegated discourse. Indeed, the sheer diversity of African American perspectives serves to underscore why the traditional narrative of religious freedom in America stands in need of critical revision. In the introduction of the book, Religious Freedom, The Contested History of an American Idea, Tisa Winger wrote, I begin this book with questions about the kinds of cultural work that diverse articulations of religious freedom perform. Rather than asking how adequately Americans have achieved this freedom or how it has rapidly advanced it, queries that assume we already know what it is and how to measure it, I wanted to know who appealed to religious freedom, for what purposes, and what it meant to them. Somewhat unexpectedly, race and empire quickly emerged as key themes in my analysis. I found that some of the most frequent and visible articulations of American religious freedom were exclusive and even coercive, end quote. Winger correctly underscores the appeals to religious freedom cannot be segregated from America's fractious politics of race and empire. To be sure, religious freedom is not neutral. Within the United States, religious freedom cannot be disentangled from the contested politics of American statecraft, nor can it be understood outside of America's continual problem of race. So that's where I wanted to center myself in thinking about race and religious freedom in this country and the experiences of African Americans. And so that's where I'm going to leave it and yield the rest of my time to Dr. Hendricks to share.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. My most recent book, Christians Against Christianity, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith, is really a frontal, I could say a frontal engagement, but I think more accurately is a frontal attack on white Christian nationalism, right-wing evangelicalism. And in it, I just, because I am basically trained as a biblical scholar, I engage the claims and the political and theological claims of right-wing evangelicalism on their own ground, the ground of the biblical witness. And I deal with their attack on the gay community, on immigrants, the misappropriation of and domestication of Jesus and weaponization of Jesus. Deal with their something that's not widely known, how deeply white Christian nationalism is engaged with and behind the NRA and the whole gun question, even how they are opposed to unions and are major part of the assault on workers' rights. And lastly, I end up showing that white Christian nationalism is anti-Christian. And so that's in a nutshell what the book is about. I will say I began though by lifting up what I experienced in my youth as the majesty of the Black church in terms of what it gave to me, what it gave to my family, and it's how it's so much more humane than the mainstream church, and that's essentially it. Other than to say, I took off the gloves and I hit them with all that I had, because they have to be opposed, they have to be defeated, because we're talking about an onslaught of evil. But we can talk about that a little bit more.
Got it. Thank you so much. That was, did you have more? I'm sorry. Did you have more to say?
No. I just stopped the video by mistake.
Oh, so I would actually like to hear a little bit more from you about your experience in the Black church before we kind of go deeper into white Christian nationalism, to kind of ground us a little bit. For both of you, I would love to hear if you have any personal experience or anything you think that participants should hear about the differences between the Black church. I grew up in the Black church in the South, in Virginia. My parents still go to Queen Street Baptist Church in Norfolk, Virginia. And it is a very different experience. I grew up, I attended a non-denominational white Christian school for about 10 years, from when I was third grade to a senior in high school. And it was very, very different from my experience in the Black church. And only folks who experienced the Black church can really speak to that difference. And so I'd love to hear from you two. Just tell us a little bit about your experience and how that is different from what you're seeing.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about our roots in Virginia, my roots in the Prince Edward County, sort of the country in Virginia, though I ended up growing up in New Jersey. But one thing I realized that, it's a popular myth that the Black church has always been on the forefront of liberation efforts. That's not true. But what the Black church has done is been very, very important for the sustenance, the psychic, psychological, economic, social sustenance of Black folk. I remember growing up and how dignity was modeled for us and expected of us. Love and caring was modeled for us. The Black church takes much more seriously love your neighbor as yourself than the white church. Now, I think one might say that some of that might have to do with the fact that we were thrown together in segregation and we had to look out for one another. I'll leave those sociological things out of it, but the result is that the Black church is much more loving, much more supportive. And I have a good friend I grew up with who's an atheist. I can't get this guy to see. He's always talking about how stupid religion is. I said, man, you can be an atheist, but you can't really be in touch with Black folks if you don't realize how important the Black church has been for our survival, for our education. I remember getting a little, maybe $50 scholarship when I went to college. Anything to be supportive. And so that's my experience of the Black church. White church has so much to learn from the Black church. One thing is how to take the gospel really seriously. I don't think that the mainstream church takes the gospel really seriously in a lot of ways. And lastly, I'll say the gospel is communal. I mean, it's cultural and historical setting is communal, concerned about the common good. The whole Bible is about the common good, not about individualism. The white church does not understand that. That's why they are the incubator for capitalism and libertarianism.
Wow, Dr. Hendricks. You know, like I love the fact that you really bring the gloves, right? Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, it's so necessary. It's necessary when we're having these conversations about our truths and our realities. And so to give a little context of who I am as a person, I often tell people that I enter the conversation as the daughter of Larry and Theriault Dent, and I was born and raised in Petersburg, Virginia. And my father was a Pentecostal preacher. So I grew up in the Pentecostal church, right in Petersburg, Virginia, Zion Apostolic. And so when you, Dr. Hendricks, I actually wrote down when you said the majesty of the Black church, right? There was a lot of love in my Black church experience growing up. There's also, because I was Pentecostal, the respect for spirit. And I've translated that over the years for myself to reaffirm that spirit goes everywhere. That is not limited to any religious tradition or belief, but it is fluid. And so I appreciate that. But in my Black church experience, we were all family. We grew up together. We looked out for one another. I remember even and talking about how important that the Black church is to the Black community, and thinking about the freedom movement, even thinking about, I remember my daddy was the one that took us to a rally when to see Reverend Jesse Jackson when he was running for office. So there were a lot of things that I got from that experience that I didn't get when I was in other spaces. And I've been a part of many different religious spaces. And when I say religious, I'm also thinking about denominationally. But that experience of love and fellowship that came from the Black community. And it's also because we understand the importance of what it means to come together and survive, like from our history and our origins, even when we think about the enslaved Africans that were brought here, that, our communities were put together. These were different communities that were put together. So yes, so we've always turned to each other to support one another. But I also find that has been the case also in non-religious communities as well, in my experience. But there is something beautiful about the Black church. And yet, and still, because I know we're going to talk about Christian nationalism a little bit more, we still see that come up sometimes within Black church spaces, which is a major concern. And it's important that we call that out, that we can't speak about all the good that we see and not give a healthy, and I say healthy critique because in our community, we learn how to do it respectfully. So.
Yes. Thank you for that. When you were talking about, Dr. Hendricks, when you were talking about the scholarship, but I remember that. I remember Scholarship Sunday at my church and going up there and getting, my $50 check and being so proud of, that they were sending me to college and just having the support of my church family. And I still give for every Scholarship Sunday to make sure that, future scholars have that support. So that really, that touched home for me. But yeah, so I think it's important to ground us in, if we're talking about race, and really for our conversation, for our purposes today, we're really talking about Blackness and the intersections of Blackness and religion and white Christian nationalism. It's important to just honor the majesty, which I love, of the Black church experience before we get into this conversation around white Christian nationalism. And I completely agree with you, Dr. Dent, that white Christian nationalism isn't something that's out there. It's something that also infiltrates into the Black church as well, just like capitalism, just like all of the systems that we're all living within in the US context and in the international context. So I want to start by asking both of you, how do you define white Christian nationalism? If someone had no idea what you were talking about, just what is your simple, accessible definition of white Christian nationalism?
Right. I personally would define it as a very dangerous ideology that is based on pieces of one's Christianity, right? Like pieces for those individuals, pieces of their Christianity. But I defined it as pretty much it has played a critical role in how communities have been able to show up in terms of their ability to live and to thrive, and also to be. It's an ideology that has shaped and been influenced by racism, bigotry, homophobia, religious discrimination. It is all of that wrapped together, and the root of it is white supremacy. Simply, that to me is simply put what it is, but it's that a certain group of individuals that identify as Christian have taken this on as a major part of their identity. Some boldly do it, others, are not fully aware that that's, that's what they are. But that's what it is. It's a warped ideology for me that assumes that that everyone has to be in the United States, has to be, in order to be an American, they have to be Christian. And that's not the reality. That's not what the founding framers intended as far as the founding of this nation. Now, that's a whole nother conversation too, when we're talking about the founding framers, because we can't talk about that in Black History Month and not acknowledge the role that they played in perpetuating this. Like they played a critical role in making this even possible, even if it was not founded as a Christian nation. The ideologies that shape it lead to this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's important to acknowledge from the beginning that white Christian nationalism is ultimately a betrayal of the gospel. Though folks focus on John 3:16 as entry into the gospel, it says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Jesus actually said something different. He said the greatest commandment is to love your Lord your God, all your heart, soul, mind, is straight on the vertical. But on the horizontal social plane, the most important commandment is love your neighbor as yourself, which means that one must want and struggle for our neighbors to have the same freedom, the same goods, services, the same security, same access to opportunity for our neighbor and their loved ones as we want for ourselves. I think that's very important. And it's also a betrayal of the gospel because it's obsessed with power. It's obsessed with control to benefit them. White Christian nationalists don't believe in justice. They believe in just us. It's all about them, as Richard Pryor said, just us. Also, what it's intertwined with fear and threat to the security and safety of them. And it's an us-them dichotomy. If you're not one of them, then you are the enemy. Right, and we can see how that plays out every day,
right?
With their spokesperson, and then they have this mindset. White Christian nationalism has this mindset of scarcity. I think it's like there is only enough good things. There's only a limited amount of good things in the world, so we have to fight over them. So they have to make sure that they get that they and their loved ones get their share, and so that's why they fight against the social safety net and social policies that benefit the masses, because they feel that that diffuses reality, the resources they could get. Ultimately, I think it's a cultural framework that holds that, as Dr. Dent said, that the civic life should be organized around their particular brand of Christianity. And the framework includes a moral traditionalism that seeks to perpetuate old social hierarchies of gender and race particularly, but also status. It's also comfortable with authoritarianism as long as authoritarianism benefits them. So in that sense, it's ultimately anti-democratic. And it has a willingness to use violence to achieve their goals by demonizing those who they see as the other. And of course, again, it has this libertarian libertarian, this libertarian strain that says that there is that it's about individuals, that individuals have no responsibility to the common good, which is the antithesis of love your neighbor as yourself. So ultimately it's an anti-Christian ideology, as Dr. Dent said.
Yeah, that was a word. So thank you for that. Follow-up question. You spoke about the us and them and just being so scared and so fearful. And both of you, I would love answers from both of you. What are they so scared of? What are white Christian nationalists so scared of?
I think they're afraid of losing a little bit of control that they're afraid for the demise of white supremacy and all that implies. But there's also this fear that's been inculcated by their leaders, right? I mean, look how Donald Trump has inculcated so much fear in folk. But that's what white supremacy has always used and always feared. White supremacists know that they are wrong. I mean, they know when they are holding people down, and they fear that folk will stand up and oppose them. Also, their numbers, they know that by the numbers, they're a minority. And I guess that's, as we've seen in certain surveys, that frightens them as well, thinking that people of color are going to treat them like they've treated us.
Right, right. And I think of, that's so good, Dr. Hendricks, because as you were saying it, I was thinking of the acronym FEAR that someone used before. I've heard many times when they said false evidences appearing real, right? Like they have this false sense of identity based on, first of all, when your life has been lived off of the oppression and the dehumanization of so many communities throughout time, right? And then also your families have benefited from that oppression. And now, now that, there are laws in place that are supposed to be fair and just and benefit the greater good, now you're, again, goes back to that scarcity mindset, that there's this fear that comes in. But like you said, there is more than enough. And the reality of it is we can look at history and see all the things that have happened, and all people of color and indigenous communities and marginalized communities have wanted was equality, was human dignity, right? Like that's all, and a true sense of liberation, right? So it's like when I think of like religious freedom or freedom in this country, I think about what does it mean for me to be able to live, to thrive, to go where I want to go and not have to be concerned about whether or not I'm gonna make it back home safely, or my ability to go to the bank and get a loan to have a home for my child that is in a neighborhood that is safe. But here's the thing, every person deserves to live in a safe neighborhood, right? So the suggestion that that's only set aside for certain people, which historically that has continued to be the case, or even when we see what's happening right now, because it's hard for me not to talk about religious freedom and not tie in all these other social justice issues like housing and instability, and how communities are treated. And this is something that I'm even seeing right now in my current context in my own neighborhood. And right in Arlington, Virginia, they're dealing with the issue of the missing middle. And there is, in some ways, again, this scarcity mindset that if we allow this certain type of housing to come in here, it's going to change the value of my property. But there are so many other things to take into consideration when it's about, again, who has the right to live, to thrive, to be, and to succeed, right? People shouldn't just have to survive, but what does it mean to succeed? So when I think of and the image that I have in my mind is what happened on January 6th, 2021. As I'm seeing all these images and people acting out in the worst way, being unlawful, right? It's like this warped sense again of identity. It's like who raised you? And I'm saying this in the realest sense. Who raised you to believe the things that you believed? What were your experiences that shaped you so bad that this is the ideology that you have decided to take on to diminish the value in the lives of other individuals? And so for me, that's where there's great concern around this whole thing of Christian nationalism, because you're now taking your religious beliefs or ideologies and then putting those into public policies that impact the lives of other individuals. Right. Who may not believe what you believe or show up the way that you show up, but then it has great impact. So I'm thinking about even how it has impact in public schools. There were last year, there were about 19 Republican attorney generals that tried to sue the USDA office because of language that was going to be put into a piece of legislation about protected classes of individuals. And it was really targeting LGBTQ students. So now you're going to take your religious ideologies and beliefs and use those to shape public policies to then disenfranchise children that need school lunch because of how they show up.
Yeah.
What does that say about you as a person? So I go back to, again, who raised you? What are the beliefs that you were taught that shaped this type of thinking for then you to grow up as an adult and become what you've become? And I think those are real questions and things that we as people that see it. And Dr. Hendricks, I have your book and I'm looking at page 123 when you talked about, that their actions are disingenuous in terms of how they say one thing and do another. But I think it's important for us to call that out. And that has to happen in conversations about white Christian nationalism.
Yeah, and I just want to say, and I know that we both are on the same page with this. In fact, Dr. Dent said it earlier, whiteness is an ideology. We're not talking about, European descendants of Europeans, writ large or anything. Whiteness is an ideology of privilege. So I don't want it to sound, or neither of us want to sound like we're attacking white people. We are attacking white ideology, and like we know that there are Black folks who subscribe to Clarence Thomas, Tim Scott, people there, we have uncles, Uncle Clarence, Uncle Tim, folk who subscribe. So I just wanted to interject that.
That's important that you do that, Dr. Hendricks.
Yeah, Uncle Tim Scott.
So with that, as we sip our tea, an important question. So is white Christian nationalism actually on the rise?
Well, it's interesting. I was reading recently a galley of a book by a colleague asked me to endorse it, and he cited some surveys that show actually white Christian nationalism. It appears to be on the rise, but statistically it's not. The surveys show that those who subscribe fully to white Christian nationalism, that their numbers have backtracked from 24%, of white Christians to 20%, some 16%. But on the other hand, those who continue to subscribe fully to white Christian nationalism have been so empowered, right? And have been so successful in gaining more influence that they're more vocal, so that their numbers decreasing, but their influence is increasing. In fact, they are winning, the war for religious and political contestation, and that's the sad thing. Mm-hmm. These folk who are so wrong and who are have proven themselves to be the antithesis of the gospel faith they claim to to hold dear, that they are actually winning the war. And why is that? Because other Christians aren't fighting back like they should. And as a Black person, I have to say, particularly talking about the Black church writ large, Black churches can do all kinds of stuff, have all kinds of events and everything. They can go to ushers annuals and pastors annuals and all of that, but they can't show up to protest policies or to advocate for policies. But these these white Christian nationalists, they are doing that, and they have many politicians in their pocket. Not only that, they are systematic, and they're working from the local level on up through the state level, all the way up to the federal level in terms of electing folk. We're playing checkers while they're playing chess, and it's a damn shame. But they're winning. So yes, their numbers are declining, but their influence is growing. And it seems like the more outrageous their claims, the more influence they gain.
Right. Dr. Hendricks, I think it's a great point that you brought up in terms of mobilizing and taking action, because that is true, that there are a lot of efforts by so many individuals that well, in terms of Christian nationalists, right? They're on the phones, they get together. It's a well-oiled machine that they have and well-funded. And so it is important that people that ascribe to Christianity or define themselves as Christians, that they speak up and they take action and do the necessary work. That means contacting your elected officials. And so a lot of times, we say contacting elected officials, and I do realize that sometimes people don't know what to say when they call, because I know when I first started, I didn't necessarily know what to say, but I had a script that someone gave me, and I followed that script, and I threw in my own personal narrative about it. And so that is important to happen. At the same time, it's about showing up for those school board meetings, because it's not just what we see on the federal level, it's what we see locally that is happening that impacts our communities. That it's the day-to-day things that right in our neighborhoods where these things are happening. And it could be sometimes like a small nuance of a situation. I'm thinking about even the voter suppression efforts that happened last year and that continue to happen to undermine our rights. Again, this is all tied into Christian nationalism. And so it's important for us to speak up, get into the fight in the way in which we feel compelled to do so. Here's the thing. It also takes money to do it, right? Like people should financially support, organizations that are doing this work. I'm grateful in my context that I have, that my local NAACP is very active, and I learned more about some of the situations that were happening in my own community. And I think that's important for people to know locally how it has impact, but also look at this nationally. I mean, I look at even how Christian nationalism has huge implications, and I need people of color to understand this, has huge implications for women of color when it comes to reproductive justice and reproductive freedom and our rights and healthcare. In this country, that Black and Latino women, especially Black women, are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than any other group of women. And so when you have people that are, again, dictating, creating laws that minimizes your access to healthcare, because abortion rights are healthcare rights, right? That's tied into healthcare. But when you're looking at that, or even the way in which you decide to get care for yourself, when it's already in some spaces, access to healthcare is already limited, right? If you live in a rural area. I read something the other day, I think it was in Georgia, that they were saying that that there were very few OBGYNs that were in certain parts of Georgia. What does that mean for the healthcare of those women? And not necessarily just women of color, but all women. So we have to see how this impacts us in ways beyond just what one person believes, but what does this look like for future generations? Also, going back to public schools, when we see what's happening down in Florida right now, when Governor DeSantis decided to oppose the AP curriculum for the African American Studies program, that again, that ties into the ways in which white supremacy and Christian nationalism have continued to work throughout time. So, I mean, specifically, the language was that it was devalued. It stated that it wasn't valuable, this education. So what is it about African American studies that's not valuable?
Yeah.
When you think about the contributions of African Americans in this country, there's so many things and ways in which families and communities need to get involved and speak up, but especially those that identify as Christian. Push back on the narrative of what they're saying about your faith, right? If you believe what you say you believe about your religious tradition. I just think that there are so many ways in which communities are missing the link. But the thing is, the story, that's why we wrote the book about African Americans and religious freedom, is to show the link and how these issues impact our daily lives and how we're able to live and make decisions for our family. Even when you're talking about voting rights and what's happening with gerrymandering, it's all tied together. It's all tied together.
You know, what's interesting, you mentioned abortion. You know, voluntary abortion is not mentioned in the Bible, right? Jesus never mentions abortion. It's just not there unless you look at the book of Numbers, chapter 5, and shows God punishes, is said to punish a so-called adulterous woman by killing the fetus that she's carrying. Other than that, it doesn't talk about it. And so what we have is these folk are predicating, they've reduced the whole faith to abortion, to something that's not even in the Bible, which really shows the height of their cynicism and the fact that they don't care what's there. The Bible is something to weaponize to keep them in control. And I'm not saying that all these folk don't believe in God. It just depends on the kind of God that you believe in. But I just wanted to raise that point. I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and it's important because those beliefs, those ideologies have found their way into law, into legislation, into policy. So these are not just beliefs. This is not just theology. This is life. This is how we're experiencing our everyday. The question of when life begins is a theological question, but it's also something that is now asked in policy and legislation and in our litigation. So these are not just, conversations that are only had on Sunday morning at the Christian church. Right. These are conversations that are constantly influencing the way that we experience American life, really.
And that's why it's so important to push back, to refute what they're talking about by using the text they claim to base their faith on. You're absolutely right. We have to be in dialogue with these folk. The primary ethic in the Bible is mishpat, justice. That occurs more than any other ethical concept in the Bible. Well, that's not talked about much in church like it should be. But not only that, what's not recognized is that's the basic definition of justice in Euro-Western jurisprudence as well. So that points to the fact that we have to have this interdisciplinary engagement of law and politics and religion. Which is why you at the law school sponsoring this is significant.
Yeah, and with that, I actually want to go to the Q&A to make sure that we get some of these questions answered. And one is from my colleague, the director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law, Elizabeth Platt, who asks, the erosion of the Establishment Clause is often thought of as a threat primarily to secular people and non-Christians. But given the influence of white Christian nationalism theologies, I wonder if you could speak to the importance of church-state separation for Black Christians and what the decimation of the decimation of the Establishment Clause might mean for Black Christians, for example, in school.
Hey, that is a great question, Elizabeth. But I always tell people that, you know, I am an advocate for religious freedom, freedom of religion, freedom from religion, whatever one chooses, right? Church-state separation. But I often tell people that we got to acknowledge that both the church and the state played a role in the enslavement of Africans, and both the church and the state have played a role in the impact on indigenous communities. And so we cannot escape that. But as it pertains to how church-state separation is set up to make sure that the government is not showing preference towards one religious group over another, or the government is not naming a state-sanctioned religion, and that it is neutral for everyone, is so critical. It is so critical that that is established. I think it has played out in the public square where it's been a little murky in conversations, especially in how the Supreme Court has interpreted things in the last year or so. But it is really important to understand the separation of church and state when it comes to, especially when I'm thinking about going back to public schools in terms of federal, in terms of public money, right? Public money supporting public schools and not going to support, religious education. That because again, religious education has an agenda in terms of what they're educating the children about. But I think, Elizabeth, that it is very complex when you're talking to for me, it's complex when you're talking to African-American communities about church-state separation, when you look throughout history at the role that both played in our lives. And then two, a dear friend of mine said to me many years ago, he's a well-respected religious leader. He reminded me that the conversation really about church-state separation was not really inclusive of the Black church. But I think that there have been things throughout time that, because of the way the laws are, that we also have to follow and make sure that we're keeping things separated. Again, because it protects everyone. It protects the church, right? Because no one wants the government to come in and tell you how to run your church, how to believe whatever you believe, or whatever your doctrines are. That is something for the church to define, and then that the government handles the government affairs. But I think that there's still a lot of complexities to it when we think about that history, and that people can't undermine how that history has impacted us even until today.
Yeah. I just like to point out real quickly that, as I understand, this separation between church and state was to protect the government from the church, and not the other way around. And so I think it's very important, because white Christian nationalism is trying to take over the government, and to the detriment of everyone but white Christian nationalists. So, and so of course it's important for African Americans, because when America catches cold, America sneezes, African Americans get pneumonia, and so we have to we need that protection more than other folks.
Right. But I want to add this, if you don't mind, Candace, to that question, is I think it's important for us to help people understand how Christian nationalism sometimes shows up in the public square beyond like just public policies. And like for me, an example of such is like last year when the governor of Virginia was at his inauguration. Right after the inauguration, he stood there and prayed, right? And so he was there in his state capacity. And so when people see examples of that, right, the governor can pray, you know, in his own time, right? But not to be a part of this public, because then the question is, like, are you honoring all Virginians? Are you honoring those that are non-religious? Or are you then pointing to a specific way in which people need to believe? And so I think people need to understand sometimes the ways that, you know, Christian nationalism or the violation of church-state separation shows up in the public square beyond, it's like I said, those little things sometimes that people were like, oh, okay, so he prayed in public during his inauguration. No, that's a problem.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. And I feel like we could have an entire conversation just about white Christian nationalism in Virginia and what is happening here in Virginia. But I want to get to another question by Professor Johnson here at the law school. She asked, can you talk about the role of Christian news services, i.e. radio and websites and social media networks? They appear to be shaping information for Black folks as well, leaning some to right-wing concerns around sexual orientation, gender identity, fear of redistributive taxation, etc. So can you speak to the news service industry?
White supremacy has always been hegemonic, and you know, it's just a continuation of that. But the tragedy of it is that, well, again, it you know, the progressive side and Black church has some culpability in this, because it is not, they are not taking effective steps to counter this hegemony. You know, these radio and the websites and the social media networks, and all, they're available to all. I see a lot of Black churches using them, but they're, you know, they're talking about their next revival and or their church programs and all of that. So we can't blame these white Christian nationalists for pushing their side, you know, pushing their interests, but we can blame us for not pushing ours. I mean, so what it points to, there has to be a more you know, a more effective and a more dedicated effort to counter it.
Right. I agree. And that to me also looks like people writing op-eds to speak to a different narrative and experience. And I'm specifically, you know, again, because we're talking about the Black church, right? I'm thinking about the fact that, you know, I think it was 78% of 78% of LGBTQ people identify as religious. Black LGBTQ people identify as religious. So these are people that are part of our communities and part of our families, part of houses of worship. And so what does it mean to speak up about those issues? Last year, I wrote an op-ed for the Religious News Service that, you know, did exactly what Dr. Hendricks was suggesting early on. It was kind of like a note to the Black church to say, hey, we've always taken on civil rights issues. LGBTQ rights is a civil rights issue. Why wouldn't we include this in the work that we're doing? But I think that, you know, again, it points to how, you know, Christian nationalism has played a major role in the ways in which people think about certain communities. Because for me, if we're saying, then this is for me, if we're saying Black Lives Matter, for me, all Black lives matter, right? It's that, you know, you can't say Black Lives Matter, but if you're a part of this community, we're going to hold off here. I think, and so again, pushing back on that narrative. And I also want to mention this example as far as pushing back, that I was happy to see, I think it was like a week or two ago, and this was done with Americans United, but they filed a lawsuit in Missouri, and 13 faith leaders signed on to push back opposing Missouri's abortion bans and abortion laws. So I think it's so important that for people of faith to use their voices to speak up and push back the narrative. And sometimes that means calling out when you see something in an article that doesn't speak to the truths that you live as a person. Like, you have that right to do so. You can write an op-ed.
Yeah. Before we close, can I speak quickly to, I'm seeing some questions about reproductive rights. Candace, and
yes, please.
yeah, you know, what's interesting is that, again, the Bible does not speak to abortion at all. What it does speak to is the responsibility to care for those who are living. And so when you talk about reproductive right, I commend, if you're not going to read my whole book, okay, but somehow get hold of that chapter in Christians Against Christianity about abortion, because there is, I mean, everyone's going to have an opinion on abortion, but there is no biblical stance to take on abortion. Not only that, I mean, I lay out the history of the responses to the question of abortion. You know, when is a fetus a human being, and all that. Those questions were theological questions. They're not biblical questions. And so if we're going to counter folk, you can't tell them that their attitude toward abortion is wrong just because you disagree. But if they're saying that their faith tells them this, then their faith does not tell them to the text does not tell them that. And we have to utilize the very Bible that they weaponize in order to counter them and to show that what they're saying is not true. I can't stress that enough. And for Black people, the question is about how do we do with Black people? Black people are more Bible centered than the white church, you know, except for the real extreme ones. And so show them in the Bible. But he referred to the Bible. The Bible should have the last word for Black folks. It always does. You know, that's strategically, that's the way to approach it. I think that has always been most successful.
I completely agree. As my pastor, Reverend Dr. Porter, will say, take them to the text. Take them to the text, because the text will provide those answers. And we are a tiny bit over time, but that's okay, because this is a really important conversation. And I just want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you so much to Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Dent for just dropping the knowledge on us and just being in community with us. And before we wrap up, I just want to give you all a last word, if you have one, before we close out. And again, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. I guess one of the things that I would say is get involved. Get involved. I would say get Dr. Hendricks' book. It's a great book to read. It's an important book to read. So I say get involved, read the book, pay attention to what's happening in the public square. And then also one of the things I want to add is there are Christians that are speaking out against Christian nationalism. And one of the organizations I know of, and I serve on the board, is the BJC, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. So they have a Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. So there are people that are speaking out, but if you're not, and you are a Christian, you need to do something about it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I would add this. This is a very, very dangerous time. People don't realize these folk are mobilizing, not just politically, but paramilitarily as well. Now, we're talking about white supremacy on steroids. We're not just talking about the marginal stuff. It's going to get worse. Donald Trump has opened the Pandora's box of hatred, and he's empowered these folk, and he's given them a justification for acting out of their worst selves, their most bitter and angry angels. And it's going to be very, very dangerous. It has become dangerous already, but it's going to get more dangerous. So we have to stand up and fight this onslaught of evil. It's evil because it seeks to harm people in order to get their own way. So we must fight back on every level and support the organizations that are fighting and do our part, and push your churches, your politicians, everyone, and remind them this is dangerous, a dangerous time. They've said that they want to crush those who don't believe as they believe. They've proven it time and time again. That's what they're looking to do. So thank you for this. And thank you, Dr. Dent. This was an important conversation, I think, and particularly to have in the law school. And I hope we do more interdisciplinary work like this in the future.
Yes.
Yes, thank you both so much. And I think the message that you both are sending out is to speak out. And, speaking out can be at a lot of different levels. It could be to your school board, to your city council. It could also be at your kitchen table,
Yes.
at your church pew, when you're there on Sunday morning, when you're given the welcome of fellowship, the hand of fellowship. Can you talk about some abortion rights? Just throw that in there. What are you thinking about? I think there's a lot of ways that we can advocate, and speaking out just starts with one voice. So with that, I just want to thank you so much for celebrating Black history with me, for talking about the majesty of the Black church, and just really making sure that we are aware of the threat of the moment that we're in, but we still are able to ground ourselves in Black joy and the Black quest for liberation. And with that, I'm going to close this out, and thank you all for attending, and thank you for being here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All the best now.